It has often appeared to me, in looking back over those curious experiences which I was privileged to share with my remarkable friend, that the most singular cases have sprung from the most commonplace beginnings. A foggy evening, an unremarkable knock at the door of Baker Street, a letter slipped beneath the knocker, some trifle of that sort, has more than once preceded a drama as strange and intricate as any that ever perplexed the mind of man. Such an instance was the affair which I have, for my own convenience, entitled The Case of the Door that Locked Itself After the Murder, a designation which I am well aware will appear at first glance to savour more of the supernatural than of the strictly rational. I beg the reader, however, to restrain judgment until he has followed the facts to their conclusion, for, as Holmes was fond of reminding me, when the impossible has been eliminated, Watson, the residue, however improbable, must represent the truth. It was in the late autumn of '92 that the case was first brought under our notice. The evening had fallen raw and damp, with that heavy, creeping London fog, which seems less to wrap the city than to suffocate it. I had dined with Holmes at our rooms in Baker Street, where he had pushed aside the remains of the meal in order to spread upon the table a litter of tobacco ash, chemical bottles, and clippings from the more obscure provincial newspapers. His long, spare figure was coiled in the corner of the settee, his knees drawn up, his sharp, ascetic profile outlined against the glow of the fire like that of some lean, intellectual bird of prey. He had sunk for several days into one of those black, silent humours which alternated with periods of almost feverish activity, and I confess that I had begun to fear that his craving for artificial stimulants might again assert itself when an abrupt, authoritative rapping upon the street door reached our ears. "Scotland Yard, if I mistake not," muttered Holmes, his eyes brightening for the first time that day. "Pray observe, Watson, a man who raps so loudly has either great confidence in his errand or great importance in his person. The tread is heavy but quick, decidedly official. We shall have something more entertaining than the agate marks on this pipe bowl, I fancy." In another moment Mrs. Hudson ushered in Inspector Lestrade of the Yard, his thin, ferret-like face even more pinched than usual above the turned-up collar of his damp greatcoat. He deposited his hat upon my medical journals with a disregard for literature that was entirely in character, and stood rubbing his gloved hands before the blaze. "You come at a seasonable moment, Lestrade," said Holmes. "Watson was about to prescribe me a course of tedium, which I dare say would have been fatal. You bring a case." "I do, Mr. Holmes, and a rum one at that," replied the inspector. "I don't mind saying it has put the Yard in a rare puzzle. The Assistant Commissioner himself bade me lose no time in laying it before you." Holmes' eyelids drooped in that half-ironical, half-indolent fashion which I had learned to recognize as masking the keenest attention. "Pray be seated. You may remove your overcoat." The fog will not follow you indoors, though it seems to pursue most things in London. Now, Lestrade, what murder have you brought me this evening?" The inspector started. "Bless me, Mr. Holmes, how did you know it was a murder?" Holmes smiled languidly. "You have a smear of dried blood upon the cuff of your right glove, which would hardly be the case if you came from a mere burglary. There is also a faint odour of carbolic about you. Some hasty examination by a local surgeon, no doubt. Add to that the late hour, your visible perturbation, and the fact that the Yard never yet called me in on a matter which did not at least threaten to involve a dead man. And we have, I think, sufficient data. The only point upon which I am not yet informed is whether the victim is a person of consequence." Lestrade shook his head with a wry smile. "I might as well save my breath as try to surprise you, Mr. Holmes. You're right on all counts. The victim is Sir Edmund Carstairs, Baronet, late of the Foreign Office, and a gentleman with more influence than many a cabinet minister. He was found this evening in the library of his house in Queen Anne Gate, stabbed to the heart. Holmes's eyes flashed, though his voice remained composed. And why, Lestrade, does the murder of a baronet in his own library require my humble intervention more than the ordinary crimes with which you adorn the newspapers? Because, Mr. Holmes, said Lestrade slowly, when the butler and footman broke down the library door, it was locked on the inside with the key still in the lock. The only window was bolted and barred. There's no other entrance. And yet Sir Edmund lies dead upon the carpet, and the weapon that killed him is nowhere to be found. The doctor says he'd been dead not 10 minutes when they got in. We've a murdered man in a sealed room, and that door somehow locked itself after he was killed. Now, if that isn't a case for Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I don't know what is. Holmes remained motionless for a long moment, his keen grey eyes fixed upon some point beyond Lestrade's shoulder, his mind already racing ahead to encompass the peculiarities of the case. When at last he spoke, it was with that quiet intensity which I had learned to associate with problems of exceptional interest. Pray be seated, Lestrade, and let us have every detail, however trivial it may appear. A locked room presents certain theoretical possibilities, but when combined with a vanishing weapon, we enter the realm of the genuinely singular. First, the wound itself. You mentioned a single thrust to the heart. What manner of weapon does the medical evidence suggest? Dr. Pemberton, the local man who examined the body believes it was a thin blade, Mr. Holmes. A stiletto, perhaps, or some similar dagger. The wound was clean and precise, delivered with considerable force, and he thought with some knowledge of anatomy. Death would have been almost instantaneous. Excellent. And the room itself, was there any sign of struggle, overturned furniture, scattered papers, that sort of disturbance? None whatever, sir. The library was in perfect order, save for Sir Edmund lying before his writing desk. There was a half-consumed glass of brandy upon the desk and some papers which appeared to be Foreign Office documents. Though I haven't examined them closely, the whole scene suggested a gentleman interrupted at his evening's work. Holmes rose and began that restless pacing which invariably seized him when presented with a problem worthy of his powers. The lethargy of the past days fell away like a discarded garment, and I could see the familiar transformation taking place before my eyes. The timeline, Lestrade. You mentioned that Sir Edmund was discovered at what hour? Shortly before 10 o'clock this evening, Mr. Holmes. Harris, the butler, had taken in the evening post at 9:30 and received his final instructions for the night. At 9:45, Lady Carstairs sent him to inform Sir Edmund that a late supper was prepared. When Harris knocked and received no answer, he became alarmed. He summoned the footman, and together they forced the door. Dr. Pemberton placed the time of death at no more than 10 minutes before the discovery, perhaps 15 at the outside. So between 9:30 and 9:45, murmured Holmes. And Lady Carstairs herself? In her sitting room on the first floor, sir, where she had been resting since dinner. The household staff corroborate her presence there throughout the evening. Holmes halted before the fireplace and seized the poker, prodding absently at the coals while his mind worked upon the problem. The door, when it was forced, was it severely damaged? The lock had to be broken, Mr. Holmes. Harris and the footman put their shoulders to it together, and the frame splintered. But I'll swear to you that door was locked fast when they reached it, with the key standing in the lock on the library side. And you examined this key? I did, sir, most carefully. Lestrade drew a small paper packet from his coat and placed it upon the table. There it is, and there also is something rather curious we found with it. Holmes pounced upon the packet with that feline delicacy he reserved for promising evidence. Within lay an ordinary mortice key, heavy and well worn, and attached to it by a thin piece of twine was what appeared to be a small loop, as though the string had been tied around something and then broken or cut. Ah! Holmes examined the twine with his magnifying glass, his eyes bright with interest. This string was found attached to the key when you discovered it. Yes, Mr. Holmes, the key had fallen to the carpet just inside the threshold when the door was forced, and this bit of string was knotted around the bow. The loose end appeared to have been severed, though whether by knife or by strain I cannot say. Most illuminating, murmured Holmes, though he offered no explanation of what light this curious detail might shed upon the matter. I think, Lestrade, that we shall do better to examine these mysteries upon the spot, rather than attempt to unravel them from Baker Street. The facts grow cold when one is not present to refresh them with observation. Within a quarter of an hour we were seated in a four-wheeler, rattling eastward through the thick yellow fog that seemed to wrap London in a suffocating embrace. Holmes sat huddled in the corner, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the flare of a gas lamp through the cab's clouded windows. He had sunk into one of his profound meditative silences, and I respected his need for concentration, though my own mind buzzed with dark conjectures about the strange circumstances we were hastening to investigate. The murder of a man of Sir Edmund's standing would send shockwaves through the highest circles of government, but the grotesque impossibility of the locked room added a dimension of the bizarre that chilled me more than the crime itself. How does one murder a man in a sealed chamber and then vanish like smoke? And what significance lay in that curious piece of string attached to the key? Our destination proved to be an imposing Georgian mansion in Queen Anne Gate, its tall windows dark save for a single lighted square on the ground floor where the tragedy had occurred. A small crowd of the morbidly curious had gathered, despite the late hour and the fog, held at a respectful distance by a constable who saluted smartly as Lestrade led us up the front steps. The door was opened by an elderly man whose pallor and trembling hands spoke eloquently of the evening's shock. This was Harris, the butler who had discovered his master's body, and Holmes subjected him to one of those swift, comprehensive glances that seemed to catalogue every detail from his frightened eyes to his carefully polished shoes. "You have had a trying evening, Harris," said Holmes gently. "I understand it was you who broke down the library door?" "Yes, sir. Thomas the footman and myself. We heard nothing from within when we knocked, though Lady Carstairs was certain the master was at his papers. The door was fast locked, sir, and when I knelt to look through the keyhole, I could see the key was in the lock on the inside." "You were quite certain the door was locked when you first tried it?" "I wrenched at the handle with all my strength, sir. It would not budge an inch. That was when I called for Thomas, and we put our shoulders to the wood. When it gave way, I heard the key fall to the floor inside." "Excellent. You have been most observant. Now, if you would be so good as to show us to the library, we shall see what story the room itself has to tell." We followed the shaken butler down a long hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow our solemn procession through the gaslit gloom. At the corridor's end stood the library door, its oak panels splintered around the lock where force had been applied. Holmes paused on the threshold, holding up his hand to check our advance, while he conducted a minute examination of the damaged woodwork with his magnifying glass. For several minutes he remained on his knees, humming softly to himself, while Lestrade shifted impatiently, and I stood watching the intense concentration that transformed my friend's features into those of a hunting hawk. At last Holmes rose, brushing the dust from his knees, and pushed the shattered door open with a steady hand. "And now, gentlemen," said he quietly, "let us see what secrets this chamber of death may reveal." The library into which we stepped was a handsome chamber that spoke eloquently of generations of scholarly Carstairs. Dark oak panelling rose to meet shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, their gilt lettering catching the lamplight in countless tiny reflections. A substantial mahogany writing desk commanded the centre of the room, positioned before a tall window whose heavy velvet curtains had been drawn against the fog-shrouded night. The air held that peculiar stillness which seems to follow violent death, as though the very walls recoiled from the tragedy they had witnessed. Upon the Persian carpet before the desk lay a dark stain where Sir Edmund Carstairs had breathed his last. He had been a man of perhaps 58 years, with iron-grey hair and the bearing of one accustomed to authority, now reduced to that terrible stillness which no earthly power can disturb. Holmes stood at the threshold for a long moment, his keen eyes sweeping the chamber with that comprehensive glance which seemed to absorb every detail in a single instant. "The body has been removed to the drawing-room?" he inquired, though his gaze never ceased its methodical survey. "Yes, Mr. Holmes," replied Lestrade. "Dr. Pemberton insisted upon it, though I made certain nothing else was disturbed." Sir Edmund was lying face down, his right arm extended toward the desk as though reaching for something when the blow fell. Holmes advanced into the room with that peculiar feline grace of his, gesturing for us to remain by the door while he began his examination. He moved with scientific precision, sometimes dropping to his hands and knees to study the carpet's pile, at other times standing motionless to absorb some detail invisible to our duller senses. "You have touched nothing save the body itself?" he asked, without turning. "Nothing whatsoever, sir. We learned our lesson in the Boscombe Valley affair." "Excellent." Holmes approached the writing desk, where Foreign Office documents lay in neat array beside a half-consumed glass of brandy. He lifted the tumbler delicately, holding it to the gaslight and inhaling its bouquet with the care of a connoisseur. "Watson, your medical opinion on the contents, if you please." I stepped forward and examined the amber liquid, even touching my tongue, to a drop remaining in the glass. The taste was unremarkable. Fine cognac with no trace of the bitter or acrid qualities that might suggest poison. "Nothing suspicious, Holmes. A gentleman's brandy, nothing more." As I suspected, our murderer employed more direct methods. He replaced the glass with exquisite care, then turned his attention to the documents themselves. Foreign Office memoranda concerning recent diplomatic negotiations. Sir Edmund appears to have been reviewing sensitive correspondence, but whether this provides our motive or merely the setting remains to be seen. Holmes next examined the window, testing the heavy iron bolts that secured it from within. They were firmly seated in their brackets, showing the rust and dust of long disuse. "No egress here," he announced. "His fastenings have not been disturbed in months. Even were they drawn, the drop to the courtyard below would be fatal, and no man could bolt the window behind him from the outside." He abandoned the window and began a systematic circuit of the room, his movements resembling those of a hound following an invisible scent. Near the window he paused and pointed to a faint impression in the carpet. "Someone stood here recently, Lestrade, and that someone was not Sir Edmund Carstairs. Observe the size and pattern of the boot print, smaller than a man of the deceased's stature would wear, and the tread suggests a style more common to tradesmen than to baronets." Producing his tape measure, he noted the impression's dimensions with characteristic precision. His examination then led him to a leather armchair near the fireplace, where he suddenly pounced upon something with a little exclamation of triumph. "Ah, a strand of hemp rope, fresh and clean." He held up the coarse fibre between thumb and forefinger. "This has not gathered dust in any corner, gentlemen. It arrived here tonight. in connection with our mystery. Watson, does Harris strike you as the sort of butler who would permit frayed cordage to litter his master's library? Certainly not. The man is clearly meticulous in his duties. Precisely. Therefore this fibre is connected to tonight's events. He deposited the evidence carefully in an envelope before returning to the desk, where he began examining a sheet of blotting paper with his magnifying glass. "Most interesting," he murmured, carrying the paper to the mirror above the mantelpiece. Sir Edmund signed a document shortly before his death. The signature is clear in the blotting paper's impression, but observe, below it, fainter but unmistakable, another signature, the initials A.V. and today's date. A second person was at the desk. Lestrade stepped forward eagerly. So it would appear. Yet where is this second document? It is not among these Foreign Office papers. Holmes swept his hand over the desk surface. We must discover the identity of A.V. I suspect that name holds the key to our puzzle. His attention was then drawn to something near the bloodstain. With tweezers drawn from his pocket, he lifted a tiny, glittering fragment no larger than a grain of rice. A shard of glass, he observed, holding it to the light. Curved and too thin for a spectacle lens. Perhaps from a small bulb or delicate ornament. Yet I see no broken glass anywhere in this room save this solitary fragment. He had scarcely secured this second piece of evidence when a soft footstep at the doorway caused us all to turn. A woman stood there, tall and striking despite the evident strain upon her features. Her dark hair was simply arranged, and she wore a velvet dressing gown that spoke of hasty donning. Her eyes, red-rimmed but composed, moved from the bloodstain to Holmes with a mixture of appeal and something that might have been apprehension. "I am Lady Carstairs," she said, her voice low but steady. "Harris informed me that Mr. Sherlock Holmes had arrived. I wish to know if you have discovered, if you know who has committed this terrible act." Holmes bowed slightly, his penetrating gaze never leaving her face. "We are at the very beginning of our inquiry, Lady Carstairs, but I give you my word that we shall not rest until the truth is known. I understand you were in your sitting room throughout the evening?" "Yes, I had retired early with a headache and did not see Edmund after dinner. He was very particular about his privacy when working on government papers." "Did he expect any visitors this evening? Anyone with whom he had arranged to meet?" "No one. He gave strict instructions to Harris that he was not to be disturbed." Her hands twisted together as she spoke, and I noticed a slight tremor in her voice. "And yet," Holmes said gently, "someone did disturb him. Someone whom he admitted or who possessed means of entry unknown to us. Tell me, Lady Carstairs, do the initials A.V. mean anything to you?" I saw her start slightly, though she recovered herself with admirable swiftness. For just an instant, something flickered in her eyes, recognition perhaps, or fear. "No," she answered, but there was the slightest hesitation before the word. "I know no one by those initials." "Why do you ask?" "A detail from our investigation, nothing more," Holmes replied smoothly. "Was your husband in the habit of locking the library door when he worked? Always he was most concerned about the security of his documents. He said—" She paused, as though she had been about to reveal more than she intended. "Yes." "He said the house held too many secrets for careless locks." Holmes nodded gravely. "And tonight those secrets have claimed him. You should return to your room, Lady Carstairs. We shall trouble you no further at present." As she turned to leave, I observed Holmes watching her retreating figure with that expression of intense concentration I had learned to associate with significant discoveries. When her footsteps had faded down the corridor, he turned to us with a thoughtful frown. The lady knows more than she admits, Watson. She recognized those initials. I'll stake my reputation upon it. And there is something in her manner, a guardedness, that suggests she fears what our investigation might uncover. He moved to the center of the room, his eyes half closed as he reconstructed the evening's events in that remarkable mind of his. We have a man murdered in a sealed chamber, gentlemen. The door was locked from within, the windows secured, no other means of entry apparent. Yet we have evidence of a visitor, the boot print, the hemp fibre, the mysterious A.V. who signed a document that has since vanished. Add to this a fragment of glass with no apparent source, and a wife who dissembles when questioned about her husband's associates. He paused, his keen gaze moving from the bloodstain to the window to the door through which we had entered. The question that presents itself is not how our murderer escaped this room, but whether he escaped at all. Come, let us examine what the exterior of the house may tell us. I have a growing suspicion that the answer to our puzzle lies not in supernatural agency, but in a very human understanding of locks, keys, and the art of misdirection. Holmes led us from the library through the servants' corridor and out into the rear courtyard, where the fog had thickened to an almost impenetrable wall of yellow vapour. The narrow space, bounded by high brick walls and flagged with ancient stones, seemed to press in upon us like the walls of a tomb. Our bull's-eye lantern cast a feeble circle of light that barely penetrated the murk. But Holmes moved with his characteristic precision toward the spot directly beneath the library window. "The ground here will tell its own story," he murmured, kneeling upon the damp flagstones and directing the light along the base of the wall. Recent rains have softened the soil in the narrow border where Lady Carstairs attempts to coax a few hardy plants to life against these forbidding walls. For several minutes he conducted his examination in complete silence, his aquiline profile bent close to the earth as he scrutinized every inch of the flower bed. Occasionally he would pause to sniff at the soil or test its consistency with his fingertips, his movements as methodical as those of a natural philosopher conducting some delicate experiment. "Undisturbed," he pronounced at length, rising and brushing the mud from his knees. The gardener's hobnailed boots have left their impression in a dozen places, but no other foot has trodden this ground tonight. The earth beneath the window shows no sign of ladder, rope, or human passage. We may eliminate with certainty any possibility of entry or egress through that casement, even had it been unbolted. "Then how the devil did our man get in and out?" demanded Lestrade, his frustration mounting visibly. "The door was locked from within, the windows secured from within, and now you tell me no approach was made from without. Are we dealing with a phantom, Mr. Holmes?" "I deal only in flesh and blood, Lestrade, though I grant you the circumstances possess an almost supernatural aspect. Let us return within and interview the household. Someone under this roof knows more than they have yet revealed, and a few pointed questions may illuminate what darkness conceals." Harris had assembled the domestic staff in the morning room at Holmes's request. Besides the butler himself, there stood Thomas the footman, a sturdy young man with the honest countenance of his class, Mrs. Dalton, the housekeeper, a severe woman whose iron-grey hair was pulled back in a style that brooked no nonsense, and two housemaids who huddled together near the fire like frightened sparrows. Holmes surveyed them with that penetrating gaze which seemed to strip away pretense and expose the truth beneath. "I shall be brief," he began, his voice carrying an authority that commanded immediate attention. "Sir Edmund was murdered between 9:30 and 9:45 this evening. Someone entered that locked library and committed this terrible crime. I require each of you to account precisely for your movements during that crucial period." Harris spoke first, his voice still trembling from the shock of discovery. I was in my pantry, sir, reviewing the household accounts with Mrs. Dalton. We discussed tomorrow's menu and the week's expenditures. At 9:30, I took the evening post to Sir Edmund. 2 letters, one bearing the government frank and another in a plain envelope that had been hand-delivered. Sir Edmund opened the second letter immediately and he paused, clearly distressed by the memory. "Continue, Harris." "He swore most terribly, sir. An oath such as I had not heard from his lips in 20 years of service. Then he dismissed me, saying he was not to be disturbed under any circumstances." I heard the key turn in the lock as I withdrew. "You are certain you heard the lock turn?" "Quite certain, sir. It was his invariable custom when working with sensitive documents." Holmes nodded gravely, then turned to the footman. "And you, Thomas?" "In the servants' hall, Mr. Holmes, attending to the silver. I heard nothing unusual until Harris called for assistance in forcing the door." The housekeeper corroborated Harris's account of their time together, while the housemaids could offer nothing beyond their presence in the upper floors throughout the evening. Holmes questioned them closely about any unusual occurrences in recent days, any strangers observed near the premises, any alterations in Sir Edmund's routine or demeanour. "Tell me, Harris," Holmes said at length, "did Sir Edmund receive any callers today? Anyone at all? However briefly their visit?" The butler hesitated, and I observed Holmes's eyes sharpen with interest at this momentary pause. "There was one gentleman, sir, who called at approximately 3 o'clock this afternoon. He gave his name as Mr. Vincent and claimed to have an appointment regarding a confidential matter. Sir Edmund received him in the library for perhaps 20 minutes. "Mr. Vincent," repeated Holmes softly. "Describe this gentleman, if you please." "A man of middle years, sir, well dressed in a dark suit of excellent cut. He carried a leather document case and spoke with what I took to be a slight foreign accent, though I could not determine its origin. Most distinctive were his spectacles, unusually thick lenses that magnified his eyes in a rather unsettling manner." Holmes' interest was now fully engaged. "His general appearance?" "Of medium height and slender build, sir, clean-shaven, with dark hair silvering at the temples. He possessed rather long, delicate fingers, the hands of a musician or perhaps a surgeon. His manner was courteous but reserved." "And when he departed, how did Sir Edmund seem?" "Quite satisfied, sir. Indeed, he instructed me that should Mr. Vincent call again, he was to be admitted immediately, regardless of the hour." "Most illuminating. Did this visitor arrive in his own conveyance?" "A hansom cab, sir, which waited in the street throughout his visit." Holmes began that restless pacing which invariably seized him when presented with significant new information. His hands were clasped behind his back, his sharp features carved in concentration as he absorbed the implications of this revelation. "The Evening Post you mentioned, Harris. What became of the hand-delivered letter that so disturbed Sir Edmund?" "I cannot say, sir. It is not in the library's waste-paper basket, nor among the papers upon his desk. Perhaps he secured it in his private safe, though that seems unlike him when dealing with correspondence." "A missing letter," Holmes murmured, "to accompany our missing weapon and our mysterious AV. The pattern grows more complex with each revelation." He fixed the butler with a penetrating stare. "Is there any duplicate key to the library?" "Yes, sir." "A second key is kept with the other household keys in my pantry. I verified its presence immediately upon discovering the tragedy. It remains in its proper place." Holmes examined both keys with his magnifying glass, comparing their every detail before returning them to their respective custodians. As he completed this examination, hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor, and a uniformed constable appeared in the doorway, his helmet beaded with moisture from the fog. "Beg pardon, Inspector," he said, breathing heavily from his rapid journey. "Urgent message from the yard, sir. A gentleman has just presented himself at Bow Street Station requesting to make a statement regarding the death of Sir Edmund Carstairs. He gives his name as Mr. Adrian Vale." Lestrade started as though struck by lightning. "Adrian Vale! By thunder, that's our A.V. Mr. Holmes, the nephew, Sir Edmund's heir. There was bad blood between them, a quarrel over money and the inheritance. If Vale has come forward voluntarily, it can mean many things." "Lestrade," Holmes interrupted quietly, though his eyes glittered with the intensity of the hunt. "A guilty conscience, certainly, but also the possibility of innocence seeking to establish itself, or cunning attempting to direct suspicion away from the true culprit. When a suspect presents himself so conveniently, one must always ask whether he comes as penitent or as player in some larger game. You suspect a ruse. I suspect everything and believe nothing until facts compel belief. However, we must certainly interview this Mr. Vale at the earliest opportunity. His timing is either remarkably convenient or remarkably suspicious. And in my experience, Lestrade, remarkable coincidences are usually neither coincidental nor remarkable, but carefully orchestrated." As we prepared to depart for Bow Street, Holmes paused in the hallway beneath the stern gaze of a Carstairs ancestor whose painted eyes seemed to follow our movements through the gaslit gloom. "Mark this well, Watson," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "We are being presented with a solution wrapped in silver paper and tied with a bow. A mysterious visitor whose initials match those on our blotting paper, a disinherited nephew who surrenders himself to justice, a locked room that defies explanation, all the elements of a perfectly constructed puzzle. But in my experience, when the pieces fit together too neatly, it usually means someone has been arranging them for our benefit." The fog seemed to swallow our words as we emerged into the street, where our cab waited like a patient beast in the yellow murk. As we settled into the musty interior and began our journey toward Bow Street, I could not shake the feeling that we were moving not toward a resolution, but deeper into a web of deception whose true architect remained hidden in the shadows, watching our every move with satisfaction. Holmes sat in brooding silence as London's ghostly streets rolled past our windows, his keen mind already racing ahead to anticipate the revelations that awaited us. Whatever Mr. Adrian Vale might have to confess, I sensed that my remarkable friend had already begun to suspect that the truth lay not in what we were about to hear, but in what was being so carefully concealed from us. The fog seemed to follow us into the very heart of Bow Street Station, where the harsh gaslight struggled against the yellow vapours that seeped through every crack and crevice. The interview room to which we were conducted was a stark chamber whose whitewashed walls had witnessed countless confessions, denials, and the desperate pleadings of London's criminal class. A single table of scarred oak dominated the space, behind which sat a young man whose appearance commanded immediate attention despite the obvious strain that marked his features. Adrian Vale rose as we entered, and I observed him with the practiced eye of one who had learned to read character in faces. He was perhaps 30 years of age, with the refined bone structure and elegant bearing that spoke of good breeding, yet there was something in his manner that suggested a life lived under considerable pressure. His dark hair was carefully arranged despite the lateness of the hour, and his evening dress, though of excellent quality, showed the subtle signs of a man whose circumstances had declined: a slightly frayed cuff, shoes that had been resoled more than once, the careful preservation of garments that could not easily be replaced. "Mr. Adrian Vale," said Lestrade with official gravity, settling himself across the table, while Holmes took a position against the wall where he could observe every nuance of expression. You have requested to make a statement concerning the death of Sir Edmund Carstairs. Before you begin, I must caution you that anything you say may be used in evidence. Vale nodded, his hands clasped before him on the table's surface with a steadiness that spoke of considerable effort at self-control. When he spoke, his voice carried the cultured accents of his class, though I detected beneath it the strain of a man pushed to the very limits of his endurance. I understand the gravity of my position, Inspector. I have come here because I know how circumstances must appear, and I would rather face the truth directly than be hunted like a common criminal through London streets. He paused, drawing a shaking breath before continuing. I was at my uncle's house this evening. I was in that library not an hour before his death was discovered, and I know that every fact points to my guilt. Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest, though his voice remained neutral. Suppose you tell us exactly what occurred, Mr. Vale. Begin with your reason for visiting Sir Edmund. A flush of shame coloured the young man's cheeks. I went to beg for money, Mr. Holmes. It is not a pleasant admission, but it is the truth. I have been imprudent in my financial affairs. Gaming debts, principally, though I am not proud to confess it. The debts are considerable, and they must be settled by tomorrow morning, or I face complete ruin. My uncle was my last hope, indeed, my only hope. And you arrived at Queen Anne Gate at what hour? Shortly after 9 o'clock. Harris admitted me, though I could see he was reluctant to do so. The servants are well aware of the estrangement between my uncle and myself. He conducted me to the library where I found Sir Edmund at his writing desk, working by lamplight. Describe his reception of you. Vale's jaw tightened at the memory. Cold as winter stone, Mr. Holmes. He barely looked up when I entered, though he gestured for me to take the chair opposite his desk. When I began to explain my circumstances, he cut me short with a wave of his hand. I know why you have come, he said, and I know what you want. The answer is no, Adrian. Finally and irrevocably, no. Did he elaborate upon this refusal? He did more than that. He informed me that he was at that very moment completing a new will that would cut me off entirely from the family estate. The document lay before him on the desk, and he made me witness his signature. A final cruelty, he called it. He required me to sign as witness, and I did so, writing A.V. beneath his own name with today's date. Holmes leaned forward slightly. You are certain this was a will he was completing? Absolutely certain. He took pleasure in reading aloud certain passages that concerned my disinheritance, and the estate was to go to various charitable institutions rather than pass to what he termed a wastrel and a disgrace to the family name. And your response to this intelligence? Vale's composure cracked slightly. I was furious, Mr. Holmes, I confess it freely. We quarrelled, shouted at one another like fishwives. I told him he was a heartless tyrant who valued his precious reputation more than his own blood. He replied that I had proven myself unworthy of the Carstairs name, and that he would see the family line end rather than pass the inheritance to me. Yet you left him alive? I did. I swear it upon my father's grave. I stormed from that library at perhaps 20 minutes past 9, and I heard him turn the key in the lock behind me. Harris saw me to the front door immediately afterward. He can confirm it. Whatever happened to my uncle occurred after I left that house. Holmes had begun that restless pacing which invariably accompanied his most intense concentration. During your interview with Sir Edmund, did you observe anything unusual about the room? Any detail that struck you as out of place? Vale frowned in concentration. Now that you mention it, yes. There was a letter on his desk that seemed to agitate him greatly. When I first entered, he was reading it with obvious distress, and he slipped it beneath his blotter the moment he saw me. The envelope was of thick, cream-coloured paper, and I caught a glimpse of the handwriting. It appeared foreign, with that spiky script one sees in continental correspondence. Anything else? There was a small object beside the letter that caught my attention. A brass key, quite tiny, and of the sort used for strong boxes or private cabinets. It had a piece of red string tied to it, an odd detail that struck me as incongruous among his official papers. Holmes stopped pacing abruptly, his eyes blazing with sudden interest. Red string, you say? You are certain of the colour? Quite certain, Mr. Holmes, a loop of red twine, neatly tied. I remember wondering what purpose such a key might serve. And was this key still upon the desk when you departed? I cannot say. I was too angry to notice such details. I simply gathered what remained of my dignity and left. Holmes turned to Lestrade with an expression of grim satisfaction. Inspector, I believe we have heard enough for the present. Mr. Vale will remain in custody while we verify his statement, but I suspect we shall find his account substantially accurate. And the question that remains is not whether he killed his uncle, but whether he has unwittingly provided us with the key to identifying the true murderer. As we prepared to leave Bow Street, Holmes drew me aside with a gesture of urgency. Watson, that brass key with its red string, do you recall the hemp fibre we discovered in the library, and the curious piece of twine attached to the door key when it was found? I begin to see the outline of a most ingenious scheme, one that has used young Vale as both witness and scapegoat. You believe him innocent. I believe he has told us the truth as he knows it, though not necessarily the whole truth. Someone wanted Adrian Vale in that library tonight, wanted him to witness his uncle's final act of disinheritance, wanted him to be seen leaving the house in anger. But the true purpose of that elaborate charade remains hidden. We must return to Queen Anne Gate immediately, Watson. There is evidence in that room that we have overlooked, evidence that will reveal not how the murderer escaped, but how he remained concealed in plain sight until his moment came. The fog swirled around us as we emerged into the street, thick and yellow as a living thing. Somewhere in its depths lay the answer to our puzzle, and I could sense that Holmes' remarkable mind was already racing toward a solution that would illuminate the darkest corners of this most perplexing case. The fog had grown even denser during our absence, transforming Queen Anne Gate into a ghostly thoroughfare where gaslight struggled feebly against the yellow shroud that seemed to muffle all sound and movement. Holmes leapt from our cab with renewed energy, his earlier lethargy completely banished by the revelations of our interview with Adrian Vale. The house loomed before us like a monument to tragedy, its windows glowing with that peculiar quality of light that seems to attend scenes of violent death. Harris admitted us with the weary resignation of a man whose ordered world had crumbled beyond repair. The butler's hands trembled as he took our coats, and I observed that he had aged visibly in the few hours since we had first crossed this threshold. Holmes wasted no time on pleasantries, leading us directly back to the library where the mystery had begun. "Now, gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying that note of suppressed excitement which invariably preceded his most brilliant deductions, "we must approach this problem with the precision of a mathematician and the skepticism of a natural philosopher. We have been presented with an impossibility, a man murdered in a sealed room. But as I have often observed, when we eliminate the impossible, what remains, however improbable, must represent the truth." He moved first to the door, examining the lock mechanism with his magnifying glass while producing a thin probe from his pocket. "Observe, Watson, the keyhole itself. There are minute scratches around the opening, fresh ones that catch the light differently from the older wear patterns. Something has been passed through this aperture recently, something thin and flexible. His attention then turned to the ornate gas chandelier that dominated the center of the room. With characteristic agility, he mounted the leather armchair we had positioned beneath it and examined the fixture's central stem with minute care. "Aha!" His exclamation of triumph echoed through the silent chamber. "Here, gentlemen, is our answer to the riddle of the locked door." He descended, holding between his fingers a nearly invisible strand of what appeared to be fishing line, so fine that it was barely perceptible except where the gaslight caught its surface. Attached to one end was a tiny hook, no larger than those used by the most delicate of anglers. "The mechanism of our impossibility," Holmes announced, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of discovery. A thread of the finest fishing line passed through the keyhole from within, looped over this hook, which was concealed among the chandelier's ornate metalwork. The murderer, having committed his crime, stepped into the corridor, closed the door, and then drew the key into the lock by pulling upon the thread. A simple turn, and the door was secured from within. The thread was then pulled free, leaving no trace save this tiny hook, and the broken twine we found attached to the key itself. Lestrade shook his head in amazement. "But the precision required, Mr. Holmes, the steadiness of hand, the perfect timing." "Indeed, it speaks of a mind both mechanically gifted and utterly ruthless. But our murderer made one crucial error. The fishing line snapped before it could be completely withdrawn, leaving the telltale piece of twine that first aroused my suspicions." Holmes next directed his attention to the decorative display of antique weapons mounted beside the fireplace. His keen eyes swept over the crossed swords and daggers until they fixed upon one particular piece, a slender stiletto whose ornate handle caught the lamplight. "The second impossibility," he murmured, lifting the weapon from its mounting. "Where does one hide a murder weapon in a room that will be thoroughly searched? Why in the most obvious place of all, among other weapons where it belongs?" He examined the stiletto's blade with his lens, then unscrewed the pommel with a deft twist. The handle proved to be hollow, and from within it he extracted a tightly rolled paper that had been thrust deep into the cavity. "The missing letter that so disturbed Sir Edmund," Holmes said, unfolding the document with careful fingers. "Written in that distinctive continental hand that young Vale observed. And what a tale it tells, Watson. Here we have not merely a sordid murder for inheritance, but something far more complex and dangerous." His eyes scanned the foreign script rapidly, his expression growing increasingly grave. "This letter is signed by one who claims to be Colonel Heinrich Brenner, formerly of the Prussian intelligence service. He writes to remind Sir Edmund of certain services performed during the diplomatic crisis of '72, and of documents that were, shall we say, misdirected from their proper channels. The price of silence, it seems, was to have been considerable." "Blackmail," breathed Lestrade, "of the most sophisticated variety. But Sir Edmund, it appears, had grown weary of paying. The letter speaks of a final meeting to resolve matters permanently. I suspect that meeting took place this evening, with results that neither party anticipated." Holmes moved to the fireplace, where he knelt to examine the cold ashes with renewed interest. Among the charred fragments of paper, he discovered several pieces that had escaped complete destruction, fragments bearing the letterhead of the Foreign Office and what appeared to be portions of official seals. "The missing will was not the only document destroyed tonight," he observed. "Our murderer has been most thorough in eliminating evidence, but he could not destroy everything, and what remains tells a clear story of espionage, betrayal, and a past that refused to stay buried." Rising from his examination of the hearth, Holmes fixed us with that intense gaze which meant his remarkable mind had assembled the scattered pieces into a coherent whole. "We are dealing with a professional, gentlemen. Someone trained in the arts of deception and violence, someone who has used the name Vincent as a convenient alias while preparing for tonight's work. The thick spectacles, the foreign accent, the theatrical manner, all carefully constructed to create a memorable but false impression. But beneath the disguise lurks a man whose past is intimately connected with Sir Edmund's diplomatic career, and whose present desperation has driven him to murder." He paused, listening intently to the sounds of the great house settling around us. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and somewhere in its depths, I knew, walked a killer who believed himself safe from discovery. "The question now," Holmes continued quietly, "is not how the crime was committed, but where our murderer has gone to ground. For I suspect, Watson, that this night's work is far from over, and that before dawn breaks over London, we shall find ourselves face to face with one of the most dangerous men it has ever been our misfortune to encounter." Holmes remained motionless for a long moment, the recovered letter trembling slightly in his grasp as the full implications of our discovery settled upon his mind. The transformation from domestic tragedy to international intrigue had altered not merely the scope of our investigation, but its very nature. We were no longer pursuing a common murderer, but a professional whose skills had been honed in the shadowy world of espionage and diplomatic treachery. "Watson," he said quietly, "that fragment of glass we discovered earlier, I believe we have been too hasty in our assumptions. Harris, pray attend me closely. When this Mr. Vincent departed this afternoon, you observed him enter the waiting hansom. Tell me precisely what you witnessed of the cab and its driver." The butler's pale features grew more troubled as he searched his memory. "The driver struck me as unusual, sir, a large man with a distinctive red beard, but his bearing was too upright, too military for a common cabman. When Mr. Vincent climbed aboard, they engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion before departing. The cab remained at the curb for several minutes, most unusual for a hired conveyance." "A confederate?" Holmes murmured, his eyes brightening with the satisfaction of pieces falling into place. "Our murderer did not work alone, Lestrade. The cab driver was no mere hired transportation, but an accomplice who waited to ensure the first phase of their plan proceeded without incident." He moved again to the desk, this time examining the surface with renewed intensity. "That faint ring I noted earlier, it was made by a small glass vessel, probably containing chloroform. Consider, gentlemen, if Sir Edmund was rendered unconscious during this afternoon's visit, kept insensible for hours while appearing merely to be working at his papers, Dr. Pemberton's determination of the time of death becomes far less reliable under such circumstances." Lestrade's eyes widened. "You mean the murder didn't occur when we thought?" "I mean that our murderer has been far more clever than we initially credited. The chemical would affect body temperature, the onset of rigor mortis, all the usual indicators upon which medical opinion depends. Sir Edmund may have lain unconscious in this very chair for hours, while his killer established an unshakable alibi elsewhere in London. The implications struck me like a physical blow. Then Adrian Vale's visit was orchestrated. He was meant to be seen quarrelling with his uncle, meant to storm from the house in apparent fury. "Precisely, Watson. The hand-delivered letter that summoned him here was almost certainly forged. Young Vale played his role perfectly, never suspecting that his uncle lay unconscious rather than merely cold and dismissive. After Vale departed, the murderer returned to complete his work, arranging the locked room mystery with that ingenious fishing line mechanism before making his escape. Holmes had begun examining the elaborate wood panelling that lined the library walls, his sensitive fingers probing each carved detail with systematic precision. Near the massive bookcase that dominated the eastern wall, his search was rewarded by a soft click. A section of panelling swung inward to reveal a narrow, stone-lined passage beyond. "A priest hole," breathed Lestrade. "I had no idea such passages existed in these newer houses." "This house stands upon Tudor foundations, Inspector, and those ancient bones harbour secrets that have proven most convenient for our murderer. But observe, Holmes produced his magnifying glass and examined the passage entrance. Fresh oil upon these hinges, recent scratches around the hidden latch. Someone has used this route very recently indeed." At that moment, hurried footsteps echoed in the corridor, and the same constable who had brought news of Adrian Vale appeared in the doorway, his face grave with urgent tidings. "Inspector Lestrade, sir, another message from Bow Street. A lady has arrived requesting to speak with you most urgently regarding the Carstairs matter. She gives her name as Mrs. Arthur Vandenberg, and she claims to possess information vital to the case. She's in a terrible state, sir. Says her husband's life may be in danger." Holmes' head snapped up, his eyes blazing with sudden comprehension. "Vandenberg, another A.V., enters our drama, Lestrade. And if I am not much mistaken, we are about to learn that the tentacles of this conspiracy reach far deeper into the past than we have yet imagined." He strode toward the door with renewed energy, then paused at the threshold to address us with that quiet intensity which marked his most significant deductions. "Gentlemen, we stand at the threshold of revelations that will illuminate not merely tonight's tragedy, but a web of deceit that has been 20 years in the weaving. Our murderer believes himself safe, his tracks covered by misdirection and false identities. But he has made one crucial error. He has underestimated the power of the past to reach forward and claim its due. Come, let us hear what Mrs. Vandenberg has to tell us. I suspect her testimony will provide the final pieces of this most complex puzzle." The fog swirled around us as we emerged once more into the night, thick and yellow as a living shroud. Somewhere in its depths walked a killer who had thought himself clever beyond detection, but the net of justice was closing around him with each revelation, each connection, each thread of evidence that Holmes's remarkable mind wove into an unbreakable chain of proof. Mrs. Arthur Vandenberg was waiting for us in the same stark interview room where we had questioned Adrian Vale, but the contrast between the two could hardly have been more pronounced. Where the young heir had maintained a studied composure despite his obvious distress, Mrs. Vandenberg presented the very picture of a woman pushed beyond the limits of endurance. She was perhaps 42 years of age, with the refined features that spoke of gentle breeding, yet her dark travelling dress bore the subtle signs of genteel poverty. Fabric carefully mended, gloves worn thin at the fingertips, a mourning brooch that had seen better days. She rose as we entered, her hands trembling as she clutched a small leather reticule to her breast. Her eyes, red-rimmed from weeping, moved from Lestrade to Holmes with desperate appeal. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" she asked, her voice wavering despite obvious efforts at control. "They told me you were investigating Sir Edmund's death. I have come because I fear my husband is in terrible danger and that he may somehow be connected to this dreadful business." Holmes bowed slightly, his penetrating gaze already cataloguing every detail of her appearance and manner. "Pray be seated, Mrs. Vandenberg. We shall be better able to assist you if we understand your circumstances clearly. You spoke of your husband. I take it he has not returned home this evening?" No, Mr. Holmes, Arthur left our lodgings at 8:30, saying only that he had urgent business to attend to. His manner was that of a man driven to desperation. And when I read of Sir Edmund's murder in the late edition, a terrible fear seized my heart. She opened her reticule with shaking fingers. You see, Arthur and Sir Edmund knew each other years ago. They served together in the diplomatic corps during the crisis of '72. The Vienna incident, Holmes murmured, his eyes sharpening with interest. Pray continue, madam. You know of it? She seemed both surprised and relieved. Then you will understand the shadow that has hung over our household these past months. Arthur was a junior attaché at the British Embassy when certain documents went missing from the Prussian legation. The theft nearly precipitated an international incident, though the matter was eventually hushed up through diplomatic channels. Holmes leaned forward intently. And your husband's role in this affair, Mrs. Dacres? Vandenberg's composure wavered as she struggled with the weight of long-buried secrets. He has never spoken of it directly, but I have gathered that he and Sir Edmund were instrumental in securing those documents for British intelligence. The official reports credited Sir Edmund alone, but Arthur always maintained that he had been the one to establish the necessary contacts and arrange the acquisition. A grievance that has festered for 20 years, Holmes observed. But what has brought this ancient history to bear upon recent events? In response, she produced from her reticule a packet of letters bound with black ribbon. These began arriving 3 months ago. They are signed by one who calls himself Colonel Heinrich Brenner, though Arthur says the man now uses various aliases in London. The letters speak of old debts and final reckonings. Holmes seized upon the correspondence eagerly, his eyes moving rapidly over the familiar spiky script. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grave, and I saw him exchange a significant glance with Lestrade when he encountered certain passages. "Blackmail of the most sophisticated variety," he pronounced at length. Colonel Brenner, for I believe that is indeed his true name, was the Prussian officer responsible for the security of those stolen documents. His career was destroyed by their loss, and he has spent 20 years planning his revenge. These letters make it clear that he has been systematically bleeding both your husband and Sir Edmund, using their shared guilt as leverage. Arthur paid what he could, Mrs. Vandenberg whispered. We sold our few valuables, borrowed against our future, but the demands grew impossible to meet. 2 weeks ago came a final ultimatum, £10,000 or complete exposure in the newspapers and to the German government. And your husband's response to this impossible demand? He became like a man possessed, Mr. Holmes. He spoke wildly of settling matters once and for all, of not being driven from pillar to post by a foreign blackmailer. Yesterday he met with Sir Edmund at his club. They quarrelled terribly, I am told. Arthur returned home saying that Sir Edmund had refused to contribute another penny to what he called feeding the German vulture. Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing, his mind clearly racing ahead to encompass the implications of this revelation. Mrs. Vandenberg, during these past weeks of correspondence with Brenner, did your husband ever mention the name Vincent? She started visibly. Why, yes. Arthur said that Brenner had been using that name. When making inquiries about our circumstances, there were others as well, Vaughan, Vickers, always with those same initials. Arthur thought it was meant to implicate that poor young man, Mr. Vale, should the letters ever be discovered. A most astute observation, Holmes murmured. And tonight, when your husband departed in such agitation, did he give any indication of his destination? None directly, but... She hesitated, then continued with obvious reluctance. I followed him, Mr. Holmes. I know it was wrong, but a wife has certain rights when her husband's soul appears to be in mortal peril. He went first to a public house in Whitehall, the Crown and Anchor, I believe it was called. There he met with a large man with a distinctive red beard, military in his bearing. They spoke urgently for perhaps 10 minutes, their manner suggesting heated disagreement. And then they parted company, the red-bearded man heading east while Arthur came here, to Bow Street Station. He stood across the street for the longest time, staring at the building as though it were his own gallows. Then quite suddenly he turned and vanished into the fog. I have not seen him since. Holmes halted his pacing abruptly, his eyes blazing with sudden comprehension. The red-bearded man, you observed him closely? As closely as the fog would permit. He was tall and powerfully built, with the erect carriage of a professional soldier. His beard was full and carefully groomed, and he wore a dark overcoat of excellent quality. Most distinctive was his manner of walking, measured, purposeful, like a man accustomed to command. "The same individual who served as cab driver for our mysterious Mr. Vincent," Holmes said to Lestrade. "The net closes, Inspector. We are dealing with a conspiracy of considerable sophistication, one that has used both Arthur Vandenberg and Adrian Vale as unwitting pawns in a larger game." He turned back to Mrs. Vandenberg with renewed urgency. "Madam, your husband's life may well hang in the balance. Colonel Brenner is a man who has spent 2 decades planning his revenge, and such patience bespeaks a mind both brilliant and utterly ruthless. If Arthur has gone to confront him directly, he walks into a trap prepared by a master strategist." "Then you will help him?" she pleaded. "Whatever his past mistakes, he is not a murderer, Mr. Tabes. He is a weak man, perhaps, one who has made poor choices, but his heart is not evil." "I believe you speak truly, Mrs. Vandenberg, but we must act swiftly if we are to prevent this night from claiming another victim." He moved toward the door with that decisive energy which marked his most critical moments. "Lestrade, place Mrs. Vandenberg under protective custody. If Brenner suspects she has come to us, her life may also be in danger. Meanwhile, Watson and I must trace the movements of our red-bearded accomplice. London may be vast, but military men of his description do not pass unnoticed, particularly when they frequent the taverns of Whitehall." As we prepared to leave Bow Street once more, Holmes paused at the threshold, his keen gaze fixed upon some point beyond the fog-shrouded street. "We stand at the crisis of this affair, Watson," he said quietly. 3 men, Brenner, Vandenberg, and their red-bearded confederate, are moving through the night toward a confrontation that has been 20 years in the making. Our task is to reach the scene before the final act unfolds, for I fear that when the curtain falls, it will be upon tragedy of the deepest dye. The fog seemed to pulse with malevolent life as we emerged into the yellow murk, and somewhere in its depths, I knew, walked men whose past had finally caught up with them, driving them toward a reckoning that would test every skill my remarkable friend possessed. Holmes moved through the fog-shrouded streets with the purposeful stride of a bloodhound following a fresh scent, his earlier lethargy completely banished by the urgency of our pursuit. The Crown and Anchor proved to be a respectable establishment in a narrow side street off Whitehall, its warm windows casting feeble circles of light that dissolved uselessly in the yellow murk. Within, the atmosphere was thick with tobacco smoke and the low murmur of conversation from government clerks and minor officials who had sought refuge from the oppressive night. The publican, a stout man with the shrewd eyes of one who observes much and speaks little, responded to Holmes' inquiries with the careful consideration of a witness who understood that murder had entered his establishment's recent history. I remember the gentleman with the red beard well enough," he said, setting down the glass he had been polishing with mechanical precision. "Came in about 8:30, ordered a pint of our best bitter, but barely touched it. Sat in the corner booth there, watching the door like a man expecting company. When the other fellow arrived, thin gentleman, nervous as a cat, they fell into conversation right quick. Holmes leaned forward with that intense concentration which marked his most significant inquiries. Could you observe their manner of discourse? The general tenor of their exchange? The Redbeard was doing most of the talking, sir, leaning across the table and speaking low but urgent-like. The thin gentleman grew more agitated as it went on, shaking his head and wringing his hands, something terrible. At one point he pulled out his pocketbook as if to show it was empty, and the big fellow laughed, not a pleasant sound if you take my meaning. Most illuminating, and when they parted, the nervous gentleman left first, again, looking like a man walking to his own execution. The Redbeard stayed another quarter hour, then departed, heading east toward the government district. I noticed particularly because he left a half-crown on the table for a pint he'd scarcely tasted, the gesture of a man who wasn't worried about expenses. Holmes absorbed this intelligence with the intensity of a scholar deciphering ancient manuscripts. This red-bearded gentleman, did you observe anything distinctive about his person, any peculiarity that might aid identification? The publican's weathered features creased in concentration. Now that you mention it, sir, his hands struck me as odd. Well kept they were, with long, delicate fingers, not the hands of a labouring man, despite his size. His coat was of good quality, but I noticed the cuffs were frayed in a way that suggested a gentleman who'd seen better times. Most distinctive was a heavy ring he wore, looked like it bore some sort of foreign crest. Excellent observation. Did he speak with any trace of accent? That he did, sir. German, I'd wager, though he tried to conceal it. When he ordered his ale, certain sounds gave him difficulty, the way foreigners often struggle with our English pronunciations. Holmes pressed a sovereign into the man's palm despite his protests, then led me back into the fog with renewed purpose. We are dealing with Colonel Brenner himself, Watson, not some hired confederate. The man has been bold enough to move openly through London, confident that his various disguises would shield him from recognition. But he has underestimated the power of systematic observation. Where do we seek him now? East, as our quarry went. A man of Brenner's profession would require secure quarters, somewhere he could observe his victims while planning his campaign of revenge. Holmes halted suddenly, his keen gaze fixed upon the imposing facade of the Foreign Office. When Harris described the mysterious Mr. Vincent this afternoon, he mentioned thick spectacles that magnified the eyes, yet Mrs. Vandenberg described a red-bearded man with military bearing, no mention of spectacles. Two different men? Or one man who understands the theatrical arts? Thick spectacles dominate an observer's attention so completely that other features fade into insignificance. Remove them, add a false beard, alter posture and gait, and you create what appears to be an entirely different individual. His penetrating gaze swept the buildings surrounding the Foreign Office with systematic precision. If I were plotting revenge against men who had wronged me, I would choose lodgings that allowed surveillance of their movements while maintaining my own anonymity. We approached a modest boarding house whose shabby gentility suggested the sort of establishment that catered to retired clerks and impoverished gentlefolk, precisely the anonymous refuge where a careful man might disappear among London's teeming millions. Holmes's manner underwent one of those remarkable transformations that never ceased to amaze me, assuming the persona of a government inspector with that precise blend of authority and courtesy that opened doors throughout the empire. The landlady who answered our summons was a woman of uncertain years, whose suspicious demeanour spoke of long experience with tenants who departed owing rent. Holmes's credentials and manner worked their usual magic, transforming suspicion into eager cooperation. "That would be Mr. Vincent on the second-floor front," she said, her eyes brightening at the sight of the half-crown Holmes pressed into her palm. "Took the room 6 weeks ago, paid 3 months in advance, most unusual for this establishment. Keeps irregular hours, receives no visitors, but quiet as a church mouse. I sometimes wondered if his business was entirely regular, if you understand my meaning." "Is he at home presently?" "Haven't heard him on the stairs this past hour, sir. But then he moves quiet as a cat for such a large man when he chooses." Holmes instructed her to watch the rear entrance while we ascended the creaking staircase through gathering gloom. At the second-floor landing, he pressed his ear to the door in absolute silence before testing the handle with infinite care. The lock yielded to his ministrations, and we stepped into a chamber that spoke eloquently of its occupant's true nature. Maps of London covered one wall with locations marked in red ink, Queen Anne Gate prominent among them. A writing desk held correspondence in that familiar spiky continental script, while nearby lay the paraphernalia of theatrical disguise, false beards of varying hues, spectacles of different thickness, bottles of spirit gum and grease paint. Most revealing were the photographs arranged upon the mantelpiece, images of Sir Edmund Carstairs, Arthur Vandenberg, and several other gentlemen whose faces bore the unmistakable stamp of diplomatic service. "The spider's web," Holmes murmured, his eyes cataloguing every detail with photographic precision. "Years of patient planning laid bare in a single room, but where is our architect of revenge?" His question was answered by sudden commotion from below, the landlady's startled cry followed by rapid footsteps and the slam of a door. Holmes was already moving, taking the stairs 3 at a time, while I followed as quickly as my old wound permitted. We burst into the fog-shrouded street just as a tall figure emerged from the building's rear entrance, moving with the purposeful stride of a man who had expected this moment and prepared for it. Colonel Heinrich Brenner, for such he undoubtedly was, turned to face us with the calm assurance of a professional soldier who finds himself outflanked but not yet defeated. Gone were the thick spectacles and theatrical mannerisms of Mr. Vincent. In their place stood a man whose bearing spoke of Prussian military training and whose cold eyes held the calculation of one who had spent 20 years planning this night's work. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, in accented but precise English, his hand moving slowly toward his coat. "Your reputation precedes you, though I confess I had hoped our paths would not cross quite so soon." "Colonel Brenner," Holmes replied with equal courtesy, though his own hand rested meaningfully upon the revolver beneath his coat. "Your masquerade is at an end. Sir Edmund Carstairs lies dead by your hand, and the evidence of your guilt fills the room above us." Brenner smiled, a thin expression that held no warmth. "Evidence, Mr. Holmes? I think you will find that proving guilt and establishing evidence are quite different matters, but I fear we shall not have time to debate the finer points of jurisprudence." With movements too swift to counter, he hurled a small glass vial to the cobblestones at our feet. The crash was followed instantly by a billowing cloud of acrid smoke that merged with the fog to create an impenetrable wall between hunter and quarry. Through the choking vapor came the sound of running footsteps, fading rapidly into the labyrinthine streets of London. When the smoke cleared, Colonel Brenner had vanished as completely as though the fog itself had swallowed him. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment, his keen features set in lines of grim determination. "He escapes for the moment, Watson, but he leaves behind a trail of evidence that will ensure his ultimate capture. The game enters its final phase, and I suspect that before this night is through, we shall find ourselves face to face with our quarry once more, for men like Brenner do not simply disappear, they retreat to fight another battle, and that battle will determine whether justice or revenge claims the final victory. The fog swirled around us like a living thing as we stood in the deserted street, and somewhere in its yellow depths moved a man whose past had finally caught up with him, driving him toward a confrontation that would test every skill my remarkable friend possessed. Holmes stood motionless in the dissipating smoke, his keen eyes scanning the fog-shrouded street with that methodical precision which marked his most critical deductions. Rather than displaying frustration at our quarry's escape, his features bore an expression of grim satisfaction, as though events were unfolding precisely according to some greater design he alone could perceive. "We have lost the man, Watson, but not the case," he said with quiet authority, turning back toward the boarding-house. "Brenner flees in haste, and haste is the enemy of the meticulous mind. He has abandoned his carefully prepared sanctuary, and in doing so has delivered into our hands everything he dared not carry into the night." Back in the second-floor chamber, Holmes fell upon the Colonel's abandoned papers with the systematic intensity of a natural philosopher examining a new species. The maps, correspondence, and theatrical paraphernalia lay scattered as Brenner had left them in his precipitous flight, each item a potential key to understanding his ultimate intentions. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured, holding up a railway timetable marked with penciled notations. "The 11:15 to Dover, connecting with the midnight packet to Calais. Our Colonel has prepared his escape route with characteristic thoroughness. But here—" He lifted a second document, a letter written in that familiar spiky continental script. This was penned earlier this evening and never sent. It speaks of a final meeting, a settlement of accounts that must occur before he can depart England with his revenge complete. The letter was addressed to Arthur Vandenberg, summoning him to a midnight rendezvous where, as Brenner phrased it with chilling precision, all debts would be balanced and all witnesses silenced. But it was the location that caused Holmes's eyes to brighten with sudden comprehension. "Queen Anne Gate," he said softly. "He means to return to the scene of his first triumph, Watson. The psychology is unmistakable. A man who has spent 20 years planning this night's work will not be satisfied with Sir Edmund's death alone. He requires a grand finale, a closing of the circle where his revenge began. But surely the house is watched. Lestrade's men will be watching the obvious approaches, yes, but recall the priest-hole we discovered, that ancient passage which served Brenner so well in committing his impossible crime. He will assume correctly that the police have secured the doors and windows. He will also assume incorrectly that I have not yet grasped the full extent of his architectural knowledge. Within the hour, we found ourselves once more before the imposing facade of the Carstairs residence, where the fog had begun to thin into drifting wisps that coiled around the gas lamps like ghostly fingers. Holmes moved with that decisive energy which marked the final stages of his most complex cases, issuing instructions to Lestrade with a clarity that brooked no argument. "Post your men at every obvious entrance, Inspector, but leave the library itself apparently unguarded. Our quarry expects to find Vandenberg waiting there. We shall not disappoint him, though perhaps not in the manner he anticipates." The library, when we entered it, retained that peculiar atmosphere of tragedy which seems to linger in chambers where violent death has occurred. Holmes extinguished all but one lamp, leaving the room in the sort of dramatic half-shadow that would appeal to Brenner's theatrical sensibilities. Then, with careful precision, He positioned me at Sir Edmund's desk with instructions that chilled my blood. "You will sit with your back to the concealed panel, Watson, apparently absorbed in examining these papers. Your silhouette in this dim light will create the desired impression. Until Brenner reveals himself completely, I shall remain behind the heavy curtain yonder, ready to intervene when the moment arrives. And if he simply shoots without warning, he will not."
Brenner is a man who requires his victims to understand their fate, to appreciate the artistry of his revenge. He will speak before he acts, and in that speaking lies our opportunity. The minutes that followed tested my nerves more severely than any battlefield engagement I had ever endured. Seated at the desk where Sir Edmund had met his end, every creak of the settling house seemed to herald approaching footsteps, every whisper of fog against the windows, the breath of an approaching killer. The weight of my service revolver provided some comfort, though Holmes had been explicit in his instructions that I was not to act until he gave the signal. At last it came, not the dramatic entrance my strained imagination had conjured, but the softest scrape of wood against stone as the concealed panel swung inward.
A breath of colder air touched my neck, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and something else, the faint, medicinal odour of chloroform that had played such a crucial role in Brenner's elaborate deception. "Do not move," said a low voice in accented English, calm and implacable as winter ice. "Place your hands upon the desk where I can see them, then turn slowly in your chair." I obeyed, my heart hammering, but my mind strangely clear. The man who stood within the narrow aperture had abandoned all pretense of disguise. Gone were the thick spectacles and theatrical mannerisms of Mr. Vincent. In their place stood Colonel Heinrich Brenner, in his true form, tall, powerfully built, with the erect bearing of a Prussian officer and cold eyes that held the calculation of a professional killer. "You are not Vandenberg," he observed, his weapon never wavering from its aim at my chest. "Yet you sit in his appointed place as though you belonged there. Who are you, and where is the man I came to meet?" "Dr. John Watson," I replied steadily. "Associate of Mr. Sherlock Holmes." A thin smile crossed his features at that revelation, though it never reached his eyes. "Then the great detective is closer than I had hoped. How disappointing that he chooses to use his friends as bait rather than face me directly." "I am here, Colonel Brenner," came Holmes's cool voice as he stepped from behind the curtain, his revolver levelled with steady precision. "You will oblige me by placing your weapon upon the desk and stepping fully into the room. Any sudden movement will bring half of Scotland Yard through that door." For a long moment the two men faced each other across the lamplit chamber, each taking the measure of his opponent with the practised eye of a professional. Brenner's gaze moved from Holmes to myself, then to the splintered door through which Lestrade's men might burst at any moment. When he spoke, it was with the calm resignation of a soldier who recognizes superior tactics. "So the trap was more carefully laid than I anticipated, Mr. Holmes. I confess myself impressed by your thoroughness, though not entirely surprised. Your reputation for methodical preparation is well deserved, as is yours for elaborate planning, Colonel, but your campaign has reached its end. Sir Edmund Carstairs lies dead by your hand, your papers are in our possession, and your escape routes are blocked. Only one question remains: the fate of Arthur Vandenberg. You will greatly improve your position by revealing his whereabouts." Brenner's expression altered slightly, a shadow of what might have been genuine feeling crossing his usually impassive features. "Vandenberg? You believe I have harmed him? No, Mr. Holmes, I am a soldier, not a butcher of innocence. The man has suffered more from his own conscience than I could ever inflict upon him." "Then where is he?" When last I saw him, he was standing upon Westminster Bridge, staring into the dark water as though it offered him peace from 20 years of guilt. I gave him a choice. Join me in settling accounts with Carstairs, or remove himself from the game entirely. He chose neither path, but wandered away into the fog like a man already dead to the world. Holmes's eyes flashed with concern. "Lestrade!" he called sharply, never taking his weapon from Brenner. "Send men to Westminster Bridge immediately. Search the embankment steps. A man may be in the water." As the inspector's hurried footsteps faded down the corridor, Brenner slowly placed his revolver upon the desk and stepped fully into the lamplight. The coil of fishing line still dangled from his left hand, that ingenious device which had created the mystery of the locked door. "You solved my little puzzle rather more quickly than I had anticipated," he said, with professional appreciation. "The fishing line mechanism, the priest hole, the theatrical timing. I had hoped it would occupy you for days while I completed my work and departed England. Your methods were brilliant, Colonel, but you made one crucial error. You assumed that revenge and justice were synonymous, that 20 years of planning could justify murder. But justice is not a private enterprise to be administered according to personal grievance." Brenner's eyes hardened. Justice? Where was justice when my career was destroyed by British treachery, when Carstairs and Vandenberg stole documents that cost me everything I had worked to achieve? I have lived 20 years in exile, watching from the shadows while they prospered on the foundation of my ruin. And yet you chose to answer injustice with murder, to become the very thing you claimed to oppose. That choice, Colonel, has sealed your fate more surely than any stolen document ever could. The sound of returning footsteps echoed in the corridor, and Lestrade appeared with 2 constables, their faces grim with purpose. As they moved to secure Brenner, the Colonel turned to Holmes with a curious mixture of respect and bitterness. "In another life, Mr. Holmes, we might have served on the same side. You have the mind of a strategist." "And you," Holmes replied evenly, "have the fatal flaw of a dramatist. You mistook a vendetta for a campaign, and in doing so ensured your own defeat." As Brenner was led away, his military bearing intact even in defeat, word arrived from Westminster Bridge. Arthur Vandenberg had been found upon the embankment steps, unconscious from laudanum but still breathing. With proper medical attention, his life would be preserved, though his freedom would not. The law, while merciful to one driven by blackmail and fear, could not overlook his role in the ancient treachery that had set these tragic events in motion. It was some days later, when the newspapers had exhausted their appetite for sensation and moved on to fresher scandals, that I found myself once more in the familiar comfort of our Baker Street lodgings. Holmes lay stretched upon the sofa, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his grey eyes fixed upon some point beyond the ceiling, as though reading solutions to future mysteries in the play of shadows and gaslight. "The locked door was never the true problem in this affair, Watson," he remarked suddenly, as though continuing a conversation begun hours before. "It was merely the curtain behind which a far older drama played itself out. Once we ceased to ask how the impossible had occurred, and began to ask why it needed to appear impossible, the rest followed with mathematical certainty. Your observation about the fishing line was the key that unlocked the entire mystery," I replied. "That and your recognition that the crime scene itself had been carefully staged. Elementary deductions, my dear fellow. The world is full of doors that appear to lock themselves, both literal and metaphorical. What interested me was the persistence of motive across decades, the way that certain injuries to pride and reputation can fester in particular minds until they become consuming obsessions." He fell silent for a moment, his gaze wandering to the yellow fog that pressed against our windows like the ghost of the night just past. "You will write this case up, Watson," he added with that rare, fleeting smile of his. "Though I suggest you omit certain diplomatic details that might prove embarrassing to Her Majesty's government, there is sufficient drama in the bare facts to satisfy your readers without reopening old wounds between nations." And the title? Holmes's thin lips curved in genuine amusement. "Call it The Case of the Door That Locked Itself After the Murder, if you like. It has a properly mysterious ring to it, but remember, Watson, no door truly locks itself. There is always a hand upon the key, even if that hand reaches from beyond the grave of 20 years' buried guilt." The fog swirled outside our windows as London settled into another night, and somewhere in its depths, I knew, new mysteries were already taking shape, waiting for the keen mind and steady hand of the world's first consulting detective to bring them into the light of truth. It was some weeks after the conclusion of the Carstairs affair that I found myself once again in the familiar comfort of our Baker Street lodgings, the autumn sunlight streaming through our bow window with that peculiar clarity that follows the first frost of the season. The choking fogs that had attended our investigation seemed like a distant memory, though the case itself remained vivid in my mind as I attempted to organize my notes into some coherent narrative. Holmes sat in his accustomed chair, a leather-bound volume of criminal statistics open upon his knee, occasionally making marginal annotations with the methodical precision that marked all his scholarly pursuits. And the legal machinery had ground through its deliberations with that curious mixture of swiftness and circumspection which attends cases touching upon matters of state. Colonel Heinrich Brenner, stripped of his theatrical aliases and military pretensions, had been tried at the Old Bailey under conditions of unusual secrecy. The evidence against him, the fishing line mechanism, the hollow stiletto, the incriminating correspondence, and the contents of his Whitehall lodgings formed an unbreakable chain that even the most skilful counsel could not dispute, yet the sentence that followed reflected the complex diplomatic considerations that surrounded the case. Rather than the gallows that his crime might ordinarily have merited, Brenner received life imprisonment, a concession to the delicate international implications of his past service and the documents he had sought to leverage. Arthur Vandenberg faced his own reckoning with considerably more mercy from both court and public opinion. His role in the original theft was deemed sufficiently mitigated by the passage of 20 years and the extreme duress under which he had operated in recent months. The prosecution accepted a plea to lesser charges, and he received a sentence that, while not insignificant, held out the prospect of eventual redemption. His wife, that dignified woman whose desperate appeal had helped unravel Brenner's schemes, stood by him throughout the proceedings, and I learned later that they had retired to a modest cottage in the Sussex countryside, where the shadows of the past might not reach them. Young Adrian Vale emerged from the affair with his legal position entirely cleared, though his moral education had been severe. The will that Sir Edmund had been completing on the night of his death was never recovered, presumably destroyed by Brenner as part of his elaborate staging, and so the earlier testament stood, leaving Vale master of the Carstairs estate. To his considerable credit, the young man used his inheritance first to settle his gambling debts and then embarked upon a path of responsibility that astonished all who knew him. Fear, it appeared, had proven a more effective instructor than poverty ever could have been. Lady Carstairs withdrew from society following her husband's death, closing the house in Queen Anne Gate and retiring to her family's estate in Derbyshire. Whether she had indeed recognized those mysterious initials when Holmes first mentioned them, or whether her hesitation had been merely the natural caution of a woman whose world had suddenly collapsed, remained one of those small mysteries that are perhaps better left unexamined. Some secrets, I have learned, belong to the bereaved alone. "You are contemplating the moral complexities of the case, Watson," Holmes observed, without looking up from his volume, that uncanny intuition of his as sharp as ever. "You wonder whether justice has been truly served when outcomes depend as much upon diplomatic necessity as upon the weight of evidence." I confessed that the varied fates of our principles seemed to reflect considerations beyond simple guilt or innocence. "Precisely the point," Holmes replied, closing his book and reaching for his pipe. "The law, in its mechanical application, can address only the immediate crime, the thrust of a blade, the turning of a key, the concealment of evidence. But the deeper currents of human motivation, the 20-year accumulation of grievance and guilt, these lie beyond the reach of any earthly tribunal." He struck a match and applied it to his tobacco with that ritual precision which marked the beginning of his more philosophical observations. "Consider Brenner's methods, Watson. The locked room was not merely a puzzle designed to baffle the police. It was a psychological assertion of superiority, a demonstration that no walls could contain the retribution of the past. He elevated himself from common murderer to nemesis, from criminal to artist. And therein lay his fatal flaw. How so? The very elaborateness of his scheme became evidence of premeditation and careful planning. A simple stabbing in a dark alley might have gone unsolved, lost among London's countless crimes of passion and opportunity, but by insisting upon his locked-room masterpiece, by demanding that we acknowledge his cleverness, he drew the attention of minds trained to unravel precisely such conundrums. Holmes rose and moved to the window, his sharp profile outlined against the afternoon light. The fishing line mechanism was brilliant in conception but flawed in execution, the broken thread, the telltale hook concealed in the chandelier. These imperfections transformed an impossible mystery into a solvable problem. No mechanism, however ingenious, can account for every contingency. And the universe has a habit of introducing random elements that defeat even the most meticulous planning. I reflected upon his words as I watched the street below, where the normal flow of London life continued its eternal dance between order and chaos. And what of the deeper lesson, Holmes? What does this case teach us about the nature of justice and revenge? He turned from the window with that sudden energy that marked the conclusion of his most absorbing cases. That revenge is a luxury we cannot afford, Watson. Brenner carried his grievance like a sacred flame for 20 years, feeding it with every slight, every disappointment, every reminder of his fall from grace. In the end, that flame consumed not only his victims, but himself. He became the very thing he claimed to oppose, a man who used treachery and violence to achieve his ends. Yet one cannot help but feel that Sir Edmund and Vandenberg bore some responsibility for their fates. Indeed they did. But responsibility and retribution are not synonymous, my dear fellow. The past cannot be undone by murder, and old wrongs are not corrected by fresh ones. Brenner might have chosen to rebuild his life, to find new purpose beyond his injured pride. Instead, he chose to become an instrument of destruction, and in doing so, destroyed himself as surely as he destroyed Sir Edmund. The afternoon deepened around us as we settled back into our familiar chairs, and the comfortable silence of long companionship descended upon our rooms. Outside, London pursued its ceaseless activities, and somewhere in its teeming streets, I knew new mysteries were already taking shape, new puzzles awaiting the unique genius of Mr. Sherlock Holmes to bring them into the light of understanding. "You will write this case up, Watson," Holmes said at length, his eyes twinkling with that rare humour which marked his most contented moments. "Though I suggest you title it, 'The Case of the Door That Locked Itself After the Murder.' It has a properly mysterious ring to it. But remember, no door truly locks itself. There is always a hand upon the key, even if that hand reaches from beyond the grave of 20 years' buried guilt." As Mrs. Hudson brought our evening tea and the gaslight began to compete with the fading daylight, I reflected that there would indeed be other cases, other locked rooms, other impossible crimes demanding solution. But for this one evening at least, we could rest in the satisfaction of a mystery solved, justice served after its fashion, and the knowledge that reason had once again triumphed over the darker impulses of human nature. The door that had locked itself after the murder had been opened at last, revealing not supernatural agency but human ingenuity twisted to dark purposes. And in that revelation lay the essence of Holmes's art, the transformation of the impossible into the merely improbable, and thence into the demonstrably true. Whatever new puzzles London might present, we would face them with the confidence born of experience, and the unshakable belief that no mystery, however complex, could long withstand the patient application of logical thought and careful observation. As the clock struck 8 and the evening settled around us like a comfortable old coat, I knew that this case, like so many others, would take its place in the chronicles of Baker Street, another testament to the eternal struggle between order and chaos, between the criminal mind and the forces of justice that stand eternally vigilant against the darkness.